I'm recording, so go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Laura Wynn. I work at a District 75 school, P79M, Dr. Horan School, and I teach an 8 to 1 to 1 autism class, high school.
Okay, good. Just getting a little closer here.
We don't really have grades, so.
Okay, so starting out here, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before the lesson and what will come after it?
Well, in order to teach functions, I had to build a foundation, some procedural knowledge. We discussed patterns, how to recognize patterns. We talked about ratios, linear equations, recognizing the x and y on a graph. So all of those were in preparation to further the work. As far as what's next, we'll continue. They haven't mastered the lesson or functions yet, so we're going to take some more time. Especially my group of students require more time than maybe a typical peer. So we're going to revisit this over the next week or two.
Talk about the standards or cluster targeted in the lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard or cluster?
Well, the standard was an 8th grade standard on functions, and they had to be able to tell what a function was and be able to graph. So there were 2 parts to the standard, so I had to unpack that for my students. And even though they're high school students, I thought the 8th grade standard was very rigorous for them, so we kind of went with the 8th grade standard instead of the typical high school standard, which also goes hand in hand with our New York State alternate assessment, which one of the tasks was to complete a function table.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplified, and how did you plan for this?
I'm going to touch on 1 or 2 from each of the core indicators because I thought it was hard just to choose one. But for instance, I'm going to refer to my notes. Okay.
Yeah,
so
you can have them. While you're actually talking.
Because I don't have all the core indicators memorized, believe it or not. So the first one, core indicator 1D, I'm sorry, 1C.
You want to take it from the top?
Yeah, let me get it out too because I want to, here we go. That will help me speak.
Okay.
All right, so I chose to discuss 1 or 2 from each of the core indicators. So I'll start with the first core indicator, 1C. The lesson intentionally targeted the aspects of rigor, which includes the conceptual understanding, procedural knowledge, and application, which I thought this lesson exemplified. The procedural knowledge was my prerequisite skills that I taught, which I mentioned before, the patterns, recognizing patterns, and familiarity with graphing and ordered pairs and the X and Y axis. And then to bring that home, I had to make sure that they had a conceptual understanding. Math can be quite abstract, and for students on the spectrum, it can be very challenging for them to get some of these abstractions. So looking out into the world, how is this going to relate to them and to their future? And I think this lesson addressed those aspects of conceptual understanding. Not only could they tell me a function is a rule, but where in the world are they going to see these functions? How is it applicable to them? And then the application piece, which would be the actual task itself. Are they able to graph a function? And yes, they were able to do that. Rigor is something that with this population can really be challenging. What is the exact or the right amount of rigor? You don't want them to become too frustrated at the point of a total meltdown. But yet I feel that it's really, really beneficial for students to be pushed outside of their comfort zone, even in this population, because that's how they use their coping skills And in the real world, everything's not going to be handed to them, so they're going to have to navigate the real world. And so this kind of exemplified and gave them some strategies to do that. As far as core action 2, I chose 2D. I want to just kind of touch on that for a moment. It says the teacher uses variation in students' solution methods to strengthen other students' understanding of the content. So really, basically, I can sum that up with different entry points. From the large function tables, which were very manipulative, Velcro numbers that I created, to the dry erase boards and function tables they could actually write on. Students on the spectrum, especially my students, need those different modalities and ways of expressing themselves. There was also the peer-to-peer interaction and discussion, which we're doing better at. It's really challenging for my students, but we're taking baby steps. So I think basically it's all those different entry points. And then the last core indicator or core action would be 3. And I love A. It says the teacher uses strategies to keep all students persevering with challenging problems. I think we actually heard some of the students say, this was hard, this is, but I didn't give up. And so perseverance doesn't come naturally to some people. It has to be taught, just like thinking has to be taught. And so we're working on persevering even to the point of frustration, but instead of giving up and quitting, what does that look like when I say let's persevere? All right, let's approach it from a different angle. Let's ask for help. Let's collaborate with our peers. So I love core indicator 3. I think that the lesson gave a lot of opportunity for students to persevere. They also, core indicator B, they explain their thinking. When they shared out in front of the class in their group work they shared with one another. Not only did they explain their thinking, they talked about their thinking. And then D, which focuses heavily on vocabulary. I try to really make a concerted effort to not just use the vocabulary at the beginning of the lesson, but to embed it into the lesson from beginning to end. And then, of course, I already kind of touched on the different entry points. The one I think I might need to really work a little more on is core indicator F, and that would be for students to have the opportunity to revise and go back and look at their work.
Moving on to the shifts. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Well, the shifts basically are rigor. They have to go from procedural knowledge to conceptual understanding, through fluency, through coherence, through application. So a lot of things. I'll say it again. This population cognitively functions on about a 4th grade level academically. So to even push them to an 8th grade standard is challenging. The rigor is definitely there. Knowing your students, knowing what they're capable of, teaching them those strategies in order to persevere, I think we can push the boundaries and push the rigor a little more. So those shifts really, to me, are access and rigor. The access are the different modalities, the different entry points that I choose for my students when I'm planning my lesson. But the rigor is, that's where the perseverance comes in and the application. Yes, they might know, but do they understand? What is the why behind the standard? And that's what I want my students to get.
So you're doing great.
Am I addressing the questions? Okay, because
Yeah,
I feel like I'm all over the place.
You're
all right.
fine. Just more eye contact.
I know. I
with the
tend
camera.
to look around and think. Okay, sorry.
Okay. No, it's good. How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
Let me take a look.
How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
Prior to the CC, as the Common Core standards, I would have focused just on in and out boxes. I probably wouldn't even have called it a function table. But since the shifts, it requires a more sophistication on the part of my students to navigate the conceptual understanding. So yes, they need the procedural knowledge, but they also have to go from procedural knowledge to conceptual understanding. And that's where I'm focusing on I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Um,
That's where you're focusing on. Do you want to take it?
oh
from
yes,
there?
I know. Yeah,
Okay.
and that's what I'm focusing on. I have to be cognizant of my students' IEP and their goals and their transition needs. And so I have to be able to tie all of that into a nice, neat package and best serve my students.
How did the students handle this lesson? Did they understand the mathematics of the lesson?
I think the students did a very good job. As you can tell, I let them use calculators because unfortunately their multiplication or even some addition is challenging for them. And I wasn't really wanting to assess that. I wanted to see if they understood the concept. And so I chose to let them use calculators. So overall, I think they did really well. It was challenging, the rigor was there, so definitely we're not done with this. They haven't mastered the concept, but we're going to revisit it again. And I think they did very well handling the rigorous aspects of it.
Explain how you differentiated in the lesson. Did all students have the opportunity to work on grade level content?
As far as differentiation, I think the different modalities, the different entry points like the manipulatives that were used, the dry erase boards, the large function table, the graphing, some were more challenging, some had negative numbers, others were just positive numbers. Even the graphs themselves were different for each of the three groups. And one of the things I noticed in the group that I was working with is the numbers were not nice and even. For instance, if they had to plot 0 or 5, 17, there wasn't a 17, so it was very challenging for them to figure that out. What was the question?
How did you differentiate?
Okay.
Did all students have the opportunity to work on grade level?
Oh, grade
content?
level. Okay, yeah. So differentiation is key. And I think as the teacher, I have a lot of flexibility in how I approach that. You have to know your students, you have to know their needs. So as far as the different manipulatives, in addition to that, and the various graphs, the way I just grouped them was very flexible. I had all EL learners together because they needed that Spanish speaking support. I had others that required more direct attention from me, so they were in my group. I tried to place various students who had a good grasp on communication skills in each of the three groups because I wanted to further that thinking process and that communication between peers. So differentiation is key. As far as the grade level standard, yes, my students are high school, but they function on a fourth grade, most of them on average, fourth grade mathematics. So to teach them a 12th grade standard, even though they're 18 and 20 years of age, would be unfair. And so I took the 8th grade standard, and my expectations were still way up here for my students, and they chose, and I'm very pleased to say that I felt that they rose to the occasion.
Which behaviors from correction 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson?
I think the one that I think they did a really good job on, and the one I'm most proud of, is explaining their thinking and talking about their thinking. That is very challenging for anyone, much less students on the spectrum, and for them to step out of their comfort zone and to be open and feel safe enough to share those thoughts with their peers. And you know, may not have been obvious. I hope it wasn't obvious, but some of the groups had pairings that don't always get along with one another. And so for them to step out of their comfort zone and to do that, I thought that was very impressive.
Would you like to comment on any of the students' work today? Is there something that delighted or surprised you with this work?
Well, I'd like to comment on all of it because I think they all did a wonderful job. I did notice there were a couple of students that really struggled with the graphing, especially the independent assignment when the negative numbers were present. But as far as the others, something that really surprised me was the outspokenness of the students, that when they did get up in front of the room to share out with their function tables, and they were able to actually explain it very well and very clearly. And so I was very proud of them and very pleased with that.
Reflecting on the lesson, what worked well and what might you do differently?
I think the things that worked well for my lesson was the grouping. I'm pleased with that. I'm pleased with the self-assessments. I like the overall content, the way I chose to break it down and use the workshop model where I was whole group, small group, independent, and then we came back together. I thought that worked well. As far as things I might change and do differently would be the timing. I think I was a little too ambitious maybe with the amount of work I wanted them to accomplish in one lesson. So I think I need to go back and revisit the timing and how much of the work I realistically should expect them to do in one time period.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors?
As far as unexpected or surprising behaviors, no. Nothing is ever surprising in this group. I did have one student who has issues with space, personal space, and she did, there was an instance where she touched another student on the leg, but the other student took it well. We handled it, we talked about it, and went on, and I was very pleased at her behavior the rest of the class period.
Your time.